one second. We are at 116b. Toner Rabbanan Shayora, about halfway down the page. Toner Rabbanan Shayora Shoysim Malach is a midverse. You have this caravan that's traveling in the desert. For Ahmad Gaius, a bunch of bandits came along with Tarfa, and they threatened to attack it. For Ahmad Echem, and one guy got up for Hitzel, and he sort of saved them from the bandits. Hitzel Emza. So he gets a shear on what he saved. The Imam, but if he says, Ani Atzalatzmi, I'm saving it, but I get to keep it, then Hitzalatzmi, he gets to keep the entire, the wealth of the entire caravan. So Gemara says, hey, what's the scenario? Idiachal Hatzal. One second. Idiachal Hatzal. If everybody could save the caravan. One second. Yeah. If it appears that everybody could put off the bandits together, so then I feel safe enough. It doesn't make a difference if he announces that he's going to save the caravan and he's taking all the wealth for himself. It doesn't make a difference. If everyone's able to save their own stuff, so then they get to keep it. If they eat a loyach, and if they can't save it, one second. So then he should get to keep everything. So we're talking about partners. One second. Okay, in 1 second. Basically, there are two partners that own this. And in this case, he's threatening to undo the partnership because in other words, so Amar, if he says, 1 second. Right. So if he says that he's saving it for himself, so then he's able to keep for himself his own portion plus his friend's portion, which would not have been saved otherwise. But if he didn't say anything, so then they keep it as is. Because he's a partner, so therefore he has to act in part for both sides of the partnership. So if he specifies that he's going to save it, he's the only one who could save it. So if he specifies he's going to keep the whole thing, then he gets to keep it. If he doesn't specify it, the fact that he saved it and nobody else could have saved it does not indicate that he wants to split it. The partnership is still intact. And therefore, they each get to keep it 50-50, the way it was initially. Rava says, and we're talking about workers. What happened was the owner of the ship, let's say, or the caravan, hired workers. Okay, now the rule is that a worker is allowed to change his mind in the middle of the day. We'll get to this, but there's a whole parak about these different types of workers. We'll get to it when we get to Bava Kamma shortly. Okay, 1 second. Okay, so a worker is able to withdraw from his commitment midday. However, as long, okay, in other words, as long as they haven't, these guys were hired as security experts, let's say, to work with the ship, but they were hired as regular workers. They weren't hired under contract. So the halacha is that they're allowed to change their mind at any point in time. So as long as they haven't withdrawn from their work, they're the ship's security members. and they're acting on behalf of the owner of the ship or the caravan for everybody's goods. But if, however, they see the robbers and you know what, I think I don't want to work anymore, and then they go ahead and say, you know what, I'll save you, but I want to keep all the wealth. That is acceptable, and they get to keep all the wealth. If they change their mind, the reason why they're able to change their mind and stop working in the middle of the day, the Jewish people are slaves to God and not slaves to other slaves, to masters. In other words, they're free people. They're able to change their mind and stop working for the owner of the ship whenever they please. Rav Ashi says, it is possible for the items in the caravan to be saved, for the bandits to be chased away. However, it would be extremely difficult. And therefore, if the guy says, I'll save it, but I'm only saving it if I get to keep it, then people will give in and they're willing to give him their wealth in order to be saved from the bandits. But if he didn't say it, so then everything goes to where it was originally. Okay, next Gemara, next Mishnah. Somebody steals a property from his friend, and it's taken away by masikin. What are masikin? Masikin are a type of quasi-government, sort of like an institutional type of confiscation.
Is this like a government seizure that the government knows is stolen property, or has the government seized it for another reason? Aware it's stolen property?
So I wouldn't say necessarily.
It says extortionist. How about extortionist?
It translates as an extortionist.
Oh,
We'll see in the Gemara. I don't think that it has to be that way, but we'll see other scenarios. Sometimes this could be robbers. Sometimes it could be wealthy, noblemen or things that just want extra property for themselves. Or it could be even quasi-government. We'll see in the Gemara. We'll see a bunch of examples. So here's the deal. Imakas Medina okay, so the guy steals the field, then it's taken away by some nobleman. So Imakas Medina if the nobleman is grabbing everybody's fields, so he says, look, your field is right over there. You can go take it if you want. Happens to be it's under the control of the nobleman, but he can make the argument. However, if the fault was the robber himself, so then he has to give him a new field. And we'll discuss this in more detail in a moment. It's not quite the way the way I'm explaining the mission now is not quite the way the Gemara will resolve the mission. Okay, Amar of Nachman Yitzchak says, Mandatani masikin le mishtabish, and mandatani metzikin le mishtabish. There are two versions of this word for the extortionist. It's masikin or metzikin. Mandatani metzikin le mishtabish. The chsiv b'motzik or b'motzik. Motzik is sort of it's like a very narrow strait. It's a very tight situation. So metzikin are those that cause a lot of pain and difficulty. Slotzal is grasshoppers, like a locust storm. So these robbers, they're called like locusts. If it's because of the robber, you're liable. What's the scenario? These people force the robber to give up his property, but nobody else. In other words, if it has nothing to do with the robber, but it happens to be the robber's field, then the robber is exempt. In other words, what's the scenario that it's because of the robber that he's liable? In other words, the guy steals the field, and because of that, because he stole it, they decided to chase after him and confiscate it to the king. What exactly is the scenario? Okay. So Gemara says, okay, this is the big one. Achve achvuye means that the guy stole a field. Not even necessarily that he stole the field. If let's say it's a group of robbers, or it's king's noblemen that are acting what do you call it? Usurping power and trying to take away property. So what happened was they came to the town. They said, you know what? We decided we want a certain amount of property. We're gonna use this property for ourselves. So what makes you the robber here? The robber is you pointed to somebody else's property. He said that's a nice piece of property there. You can take it. By pointing to the property, you cause the king to confiscate it. Another version is in other words, non-Jews forced him to show them, show them a good field, and he showed them his friend's field amongst the fields that he was pointing to. And then we get to a bunch of stories on the subject. There was a fellow that pointed to a measurement of wheat that belonged to the exilarch. Also, so the exilarch brought this guy to Rav Nachman. They said they said that because he pointed at their wheat, that's why the bandits confiscated it. Rav Nachman said he has to pay. Yosef Rav Yosef Achur Rav Huna Bar Chia. Yosef Rav Huna Bar Chia came to Rav Nachman. So Rav Yosef was standing out in back of Rav Huna in back of Rav Nachman. Rav Huna says to Rav Nachman, Dina Iknasa. Is this the law or is this penalty? Why are you requiring this guy who pointed at the wheat of the exilarch to pay? Is it because you're giving him a penalty, or is it because this is the law? The law is that if you point to somebody else's property, you have to pay for it. So Amar Lei, so Nachman says, Masnisin it's the Mishnah. The Tanani Machmas Gazan Chayav Lahamad Lisa Da'achar V'Kin Medach V'Echvuye. He said, what do you mean? The Mishnah says if you point that if the property was stolen because of the robber, then he has to pay. And we explained what does that mean? That you pointed. But okay, so it's clearly a Mishnah. So after Rav Huna left, after Nachman left, so Rav Yosef was sitting in back of Rav Huna, he turns to Rav Huna and he says to him, so what difference does it make if it's the law or it's a penalty? He says to him, if it's the law, we can learn from it. If it's a penalty, we cannot learn from this law because each penalty situation is its own scenario. It could depend on who the person was and what his prior history is, etc. So Gemara says, and how do we know that we cannot learn from a knas? The Tanya we learned. Okay, just very briefly here. What are we talking about here? We're talking about hezek she'ein nicker. What's a hezek she'ein nicker? It's a damage, but it's not readily visible. Okay, how do you do that? Very simple. The Tanya we learned. Mitame is you take somebody else's food that is tahar and you make it tameh. Right? Or even if you didn't make it tameh, you mixed it in with something that was tameh in a way that it isn't bottle. So therefore, you cannot consume it. Or menasach, you pour it for idol worship. You pour wine for idol worship. So they said if you do this stuff to your friend's wine, then you have to pay for it. Then they made a further decree. Af hamedama. What's medama? Medama is very simple. A friend of yours had a pallet full of apples, right? It's 500 apples in the pallet, let's say, and you took 6 apples of truma and you put it into the pallet, and nobody knows which apples are which. So now the whole thing has to be sold to a kohen as if it was truma. It's a major loss. So the court had to say, medama, you also have to pay. So the Gemara says, chazru in, the court had to add it as a penalty. However, loy chazru loy, but if the court did not add it, we would not be able to make this interpretation ourselves. My time, but what's the reason? Lav mishum de knasahu, knasah legamrinan, because it's a penalty. Because in truth, you didn't actually damage his stuff, and therefore you should be exempt. However, because we can't allow this to happen, we give a penalty. Because it's a penalty, we don't learn from a penalty. We can't equate new scenarios. So Gemara says, no, not necessarily. Mikar Savr to have some more b'chashul, have some more loy chashul. So if Savr to have some more nami chashul. Okay, in the scenario of the wine being poured, right? So that's a total loss. The wine is now forbidden. Can't have any benefit of the wine. Similarly, if the item that you made tameh was actually truma, you basically also run it as a loss. Unlike the situation of medamea, where you put truma apples into a pallet of apples, In that case, you could at least sell the apples at a loss to a kayan as if the whole thing was truma. So therefore, I would think that lehefs and muat for a small loss, they weren't concerned about that. Well, with Saif Savri, in the end, they said lehefs and muat nami they will require payment even for a small loss. Okay, so in other words, it could be that the difference between the first and second decrees, the first decree was only tamei and menasach, pouring wine for idol worship. The second decree included midamea, also if you mixed in truma. The second decree is different than the first decree substantially because the second decree is much less of a loss. So in other words, it could be that had it been identical, we would be able to learn penalties from each other. We would be able to include different events in the same rubric as other events which are known to get penalties. But this is not a good example. But this is a different story because over here it's a different category. It's a small loss, not a big loss. So Marshall says, we have the Bryce that says Durabovin. Initially, they included tamei and dimua. Dimua is mixing in truma, and if you made the truma tamei, they included also somebody who pours wine for idol worshippers. Now, in this case, pouring wine for idol worshippers is a total loss. Truma that becomes tamei is also basically a total loss. Okay, so clearly we see here that they are identical, and yet we needed a second court. We couldn't compare them on our own. Clearly, this supports the idea that Rapuna mentioned, that penalties cannot be included without specific knowledge. We can't compare them to each other. So the Gemara says, must be because we don't compare our penalties. The Gemara says, no, initially we went with Rav Oven, in the end we went with Rabbi Yirmiyah. We're at the first wide line, medium line, 117a, second to last word on the line.
Okay.
I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but Mikar Savik Rav Oven, initially they held like Rav Oven, Rav Oven Zarchetz Mitchilas Arba L'B'Seif Arba, Mikar Shiroi B'Chasei Potter Shirakir Tzarech Hanachol. Okay, the idea of Rav Oven is very simple. Let's say you want to violate the laws of Shabbos by carrying in public. So you pick it up, you walk 4 arms, you put it down. It says Rav Oven, if you picked it up and you started ripping your clothes in the middle, ripping somebody else's clothes, and then you put it down, you're exempt from payment because of Kollel D'Rabbanan. Meaning, because you were violating Shabbos at the time that you were because you ripped something at the time you were violating the laws of Shabbos, you are exempt.
Because of the ripping, or because one of them is more severe than the other?
Because one is more severe than the other. Okay, so that was the initial thought process. You pour wine for idol worship, you're liable for idol worship. However, in the end, they realized Rabbi Yirmiyah. What does Rabbi Yirmiyah say? So initially they said, look, you're picking up the wine to pour for idol worship, you're pouring, you get a more severe penalty. But in the end, they said, look at Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, when did you steal it? By picking up the barrel. You're only liable for the death penalty once you pour it. So it happens actually at 2 separate times, and therefore you could be liable. Okay. So in other words, we still have not proved the point that Rav Huna made that penalties cannot be compared to each other. That point remains unresolved. Okay, next story. Rav Huna bar Yehudah ikla lebei Avuni. Rav Huna came to the town of Avuni. They brought him in front of Rava. Did you have any stories come to you recently? So he said, yeah, I did. I had a story where the non-Jews forced a Jew to give them property, but he pointed to his friend's property, and I made the guy pay for pointing. You have to redo this scenario. You can't make him pay for it. The Tanya we learned, Potter. Pointing is not enough to make you liable. In order to be liable, what do you need to do? You have to actually pick up your friend's stuff and give it to the non-Jew. Rabba says, Rabba says that if of your own accord you pointed to your friend's property, then that's as if you handle the money. So let's explain. Rav Huna's scenario was where non-Jews came to a Jew, put a gun to his head, and said, "Tell me who has the most productive property in the field." And he pointed to his friends. Says Rav, in that scenario, you're exempt. Why? Because he was under the threat of a gun when he made that point. In that scenario, the only way he'd be liable is if he literally went to his friend's house, picked up the item, and gave it to the non-Jew, which we'll soon modify in a moment.
Whether it's a gun or not.
No, this scenario.
Mhm.
But Rob points out, let's say you weren't under the threat of a gun, and you went to the non-Jew and you said, that guy, he's got the best property. Then you would be liable, even though you didn't actually handle the item. The difference in Rav Huna's scenario is that he was already under threat when he had the points. There was a guy who was forced by non-Jews. So he pointed to the wine of Rav Mori, the son of Rav Pinchas, the son of Rav Chisda. So the non-Jews, they had a gun to his head. He said, "Oh, they said to him, oh, you have that." The non-Jews pointed a gun to his head. They said, "We need something to drink." So he pointed to somebody else's wine. Said, "Okay." With a gun to his head, they said, "Okay, you better help us carry the wine out." Also, Kamei Ravashi. So they went in front of Ravashi. Does he have to pay or not? He helped them carry the wine. So, Patrone, he exempted them. The rabbi said to Ravashi, "What do you mean? He carried it. He should be liable for carrying." They said, Ravashi says, look, if the guy had the gun to his head, he says, "This here, you can take this wine," and then voluntarily he went ahead and carried the wine, then he'd be liable. But over here, they forced him, under threat of his life, to go carry out the wine. Therefore, he's exempt. It's a more lenient situation. The terrorist basically forces the guy to get a bundle of wheat, eshkla ovim, or a group of grapes. And he stuck out his hand and got it for him. Chayev, he's liable. So clearly here, he was forced to move something to take the grapes off the vine, and he's still liable. What happened was, it's an interesting story. The guy was on the other side of a river, couldn't cross the river. So he pointed his gun across the river and he says, "Go get me some stuff." Right? It was a pistol, whatever. He doesn't have the range to shoot across the river.
We didn't say which stuff.
No. The point is that he was threatening the guy, but he wasn't able. This wasn't a threat that anybody should have been scared of, because it wasn't realistic to expect that he'd be able to fulfill the threat.
Mhm.
So therefore, the guy who went ahead and gave him stuff anyway, even though he was under threat, but because the threats weren't realistic, therefore the guy who brought the grapes is liable. The proof of that is because it said Haishid, he said hand it over, Velatani Tain, didn't say give it to me. Meaning Haishid, he had to throw it over the river. Shmamina, this is a good proof. Next story, Ahu Shusa. To have a minsu Allah betray. Second. Yeah, there were these traps that two guys were fighting over. There was either a trap for fish or it was a trap for animals. Each one said, "It's mine." So one guy said, "You know what? I'm going to go pay taxes with these traps, and the king will confiscate it." Abai says, the guy can argue, "Yeah, it's true. I gave it to the king to pay my taxes, but it's mine. That's why I'm able to do it. Nothing wrong here." So Rova says, "What do you mean? You're in the middle of a fight. We don't trust the guy that it's actually his. Maybe he's just taking his friend's stuff." Because he sort of plays this game to win the case. In other words, he wants to win the case. So what does he do? He pays taxes with the money in dispute. So what we do is we say to him, he has to go buy it back from the king, the tax agency, and bring it to court. Otherwise, we excommunicate him. Next story. He pointed to his friend's grain. I'm sorry. he intended on pointing to his friend's grain. Also, Kamei to Rav. So he went in front of Rav. Amalei. So Rav says, "Leisachvi v'leisachvi." Don't point at your friend's grain. Amalei. He says, "I don't care. Machivna umachivna. I'm not listening to you." And remember, Rav is the rabbi of town. He says, "I don't care what you say. I'm not listening. I'm doing what I would like to do." So Yosef Rav Kahana Kamei to Rav. So Rav Kahana was in front of Rav. He saw this going on. So Sham de Lakuimine. He dislodged the guy's head from his shoulders. In English, he killed him. So Rav Eluye Banecha. So Rav spoke about Rav Kahana. He said, "Banecha alfu shechvu b'roish kachutzes kesay michmar." Like a wild animal. Masay zeh kivan shenafal b'michmar. Just like this wild animal, when it falls in a trap, emerachman olav. We know nobody has compassion. They kill it right away. So this guy is ready to hand over his friend's stuff to the king, and once it's handed over to the king, there's no chance of him ever getting it back. So he said to him, "This guy is clearly a threat to society, and the fact that you killed him, it's too bad." So until now, the Parsoim, the Persians, were in control, and they didn't really care that much about murder. But now there are the Greeks, the Kapta Shvichas Damim. They do care about murder. They're going to call you a murderer now for killing this guy. So he says to him, so Rav Kahana says, Rav says to Rav Kahana, "Kum sakla Yisrael, go to Israel, and to escape the potential penalties that you'll face here for murder." He says, but one thing, you're going to go to Israel, you're going to meet up with Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, no matter how great you are in learning, remember this. Accept upon yourself you will not ask Rabbi Yochanan a question for 7 years. For 7 years, you have to show deference to Rabbi Yochanan, and you cannot question him. You can't question anything he does. You cannot show him any irreverence. Fine. Also, he went to Israel. He finds Rish Lakish the Yosef become Tzayim as sifted the Yomi Rabban. Rish Lakish would review the lecture of Rabbi Yochanan every day. Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, by the way, remember, were contemporaries. We'll get to Bava Kamma soon. We'll learn that actually Rish Lakish was the head of the thieves. He jumped in the river with the intention of raping Rabbi Yochanan until he realized Rabbi Yochanan was a male. And then Rabbi Yochanan promised his daughter to Rish Lakish, and Rish Lakish accepted if he starts learning. Yeah. And Rish Lakish accepted, and then he did not marry her, and he became a great rabbi. No, he did not marry Rabbi Yochanan's daughter. Rabbi Yochanan's sister, I'm sorry. We'll get to it. It's a story in Bava Kamma. It's about 3 months away. Okay. Regardless, so Rish Lakish used to review the lecture of Rabbi Yochanan. Okay. So basically, Rav Kahana started talking about the lecture of Rabbi Yochanan. So Amr Rish Lakish like who's reviewing this? Amai Amr Hai Kusha, Hai Kusha, Hai Piruka, Hai Piruka. So Rish Lakish realized that the student body was much more engaged. He said, "What's going on? Where are you getting this stuff from?" So Amr Rish Lakish, also Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish. So Rish Lakish, they told Rish Lakish there's this new guy in town. His name is Rav Kahana, and he's sort of helping us out. And that's how we know the lecture very well. So also Rish Lakish, Rish Lakish told Rabbi Yochanan, we have this new guest in town, he's a brilliant scholar. Ari Yomi Bava, a lion has come up from Bavel. La'ayin Marav Mesifta de Lamachar. Tomorrow you can start talking to him. Lamachar is Bava Kamma. So fine, tomorrow the next day they honored Rav Kahana by putting him in the front row. Kamed Rabbi Yochanan in front of Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Shmaitza, so Rabbi Yochanan said something. Actually, and Rav Kahana was silent. Shmaitza actually said something else, and Rav Kahana was also silent. Rav Kahana was completely silent during the entire lecture. So what did they do? He said, clearly you're not worthy. They kept on moving him back a bench. This was a sign of disrespect. In other words, they had 7 benches lined up in front of Rabbi Yochanan. The greatest scholars were on the first bench, the least were on the last bench. So they moved him to the last bench. Rabbi Yochanan says to Rish Lakish, Arisha Amarta Nasa Shuel. The lion you spoke about, he became a fox. So Rav Kahana heard that he saw that they moved him back 7 benches. So what did he say? He says, Amar Yehi Rav Dahani Shevadori Lehevi Chilav Sheva Shonim. The Amar Li Rav. These 7 benches should be like the 7 questions, the 7 years that Rav told me to be quiet, because they insulted me and moved me back 7 benches. This should be that at this point I'm allowed to show I'm allowed to begin questioning the statements of Rabbi Yochanan. That was not a good idea, as we'll soon see. Okay, so Kamakari, so he got up. He says, if you start again, I'll ask you questions. So fine. So Rabbi Yochanan was, I guess he fell for the bait. He's a good teacher. So he says, he started from the beginning. Actually, open Bava Kamma. So they kept on asking questions. They moved him back to the first row. Actually, so he kept on saying things, and Rav Kahana kept on engaging him on his statements. Rabbi Yochanan was sitting on 7 stools, as a sign of humility. For every question he couldn't answer, he took away a chair. Finally, he lost all his 7 chairs. He was sitting on the floor. So Rabbi Yochanan was an elderly person, and his eyelashes or his eyelids were covering his eyes. He couldn't see very well. So he says, open, lift up my eyebrows so I can see what Rav Kahana looks like. So they took a silver tweezers and they lifted up his eyes. It appears that Rav Kahana had a cleft lip, and Rav Yochanan didn't recognize this immediately, and he thought Rav Kahana was smiling. It could also be that there is a I've seen this also sometimes. There is a deformity where people look like they're smiling the whole day. Their flat expression is a smile. It could be that was the deformity that Rav Kahana had. I've seen this. I've seen people that they're always smiling. It's not because they're always happy. They have a certain deformity. There's a word for it.
There are worse defects out there.
Okay, regardless, this is a pretty bad one. Why? Because he thought that Rav Kahana was smiling at him, even though Rav Kahana wasn't smiling. He had just this defect of his lips that it looked like he was smiling. So Cholash Daiti, Rabbi Yochanan, he sort of lost his mind. Because of that, it was decreed from heaven that Rav Kahana should die because of that, because of the pain that Rav Yochanan went through, and Rav Kahana died. Rav Yochanan said to the rabbis, "Chazisu lebavlo hechiafet." So Rav Yochanan was complaining to his students, "Do you see how disrespectful this guy from Bavel was?" So relates. They said to him, "You should know." He said, "He wasn't disrespectful. It's just he has this deformity. It looks like he's smiling, but he's not. He wasn't smiling." So Rabbi Yochanan felt very guilty. He caused Rav Kahana to die. So what do you think he did? So Osel Gabi Ma'arta, he went to the tomb, the cave where Rav Kahana was buried.
Oh, wrong one.
Just turning the page now, 117b. There was a serpent that was guarding the cave. He said, "Snake, open your mouth and let me go. I'd like, as a rabbi, I'd like to visit my student." But the snake wouldn't budge. So he says, let a friend meet another friend. He would not open his mouth. He wouldn't leave. He said, let the student, he called himself, Rav Yochanan called himself a student, calling Rav Kahana, the rabbi, the teacher. So the serpent allowed him to enter. So he prayed to God, and he revivified Rav Kahana. Now, so Rav Kahana was sort of, in the quasi-revivified state. So Rav Yochanan apologized. He says, "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you had this deformity." So he says, "Come, let's go out of the cave." So he says back to him, he says, "If you pray that you're not going to kill me again, then fine, I'll come with you. I'm not interested. I've already experienced death once. I don't have to experience it again." Okay, Tyre, so he awakened Rav Kahana and he took him out of the cave. Ukme, so he put him in front, and Shaili kol sveiked the havalei, upashit nanialei. So Rav Yochanan asked him all the great questions Rav Yochanan always had. He asked Rav Kahana, and Rav Kahana answered him. Okay, Rav Yochanan, this is what Rav Yochanan said. Delchain Amri, Delchainhi. You thought that Torah was in the hands of the people of Israel, but the actual truth is, it's the people of Bavel that have Torah. Rav Kahana was clearly a much greater scholar than Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, Rashi also brings down the Gemara in a few places. Rav Kahana used to mention the fact that he died. He sort of understood what it was like to die. Anyway, Okay, I'm Tchosa, the Rav Abba. There was a guy who pointed to the silk coat of Rav Abba. Yosef Bavur of Chanina bar Papi, Rav Yitzchak Nafcha. So there was a quarter of Bavur of Chanina and Rav Yitzchak. The Yosef Rav Eloi Gabayu, and Rav Eloi was the head of the court. So they thought that the guy who pointed to the coat is liable. Very simply, the Mishnah points out that if a rabbi who is leading a court errs in his judgment, then he has to pay out of his own pocket. So he said something was kosher. He said something wasn't kosher. Really was kosher. He has to pay for it. So they said, okay, well, over here, in other words, you see here that a verbal statement constitutes damages. Similarly, pointing to somebody's property to have it be collected by the king also constitutes damages. Fine. So Rav Eloi says, Rav, Rav said this is only where he's actually handled the item. He's taken in other words, he said something is something. There was something that was tar. He says it's tummy. He says, you know what? To prove it to you, I'm going to take the cockroach and put it on and make it tummy. Then the rabbi is liable. But if he makes a mistake in judgment, he's actually not liable. So therefore, there's no proof. Because in the scenario of erring in judgment, words alone are not sufficient. You have to actually do what you said. So you said it's tummy, you took the cockroach and you put it on. Okay. So Amrlei, 1 second. So Amrlei Zil Lagabadir Shimon Ben Yakum Verbaloza and Bedos Diana Dina de Garmi. So Rabbi Eloi says, listen, our court isn't sure what to do. Go to the court of Rav Shimon Ben Yakum and Verbaloza and Bedos because they have the law of Garmi. Garmi is sort of indirect damage, but it's still mostly immediate. According to the Ritzvah, there are 3 conditions to Garmi. It has to happen immediately. It has to happen by the person. Is the 3rd condition, which I can't remember. Regardless, it's much more immediate, and they'll make him pay for it. Therefore, they'll make him pay because by him pointing to the item, that constitutes an immediate damage. So yes, he went to the court. Also, he said, they said, look, you're liable because of our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says you point to the field, you're liable. That's how we explain the Mishnah. Therefore, in this scenario, you're liable as well. Okay, next Gemara. There was a guy who was watching a silver cup. So robbers came to his house. They wanted the cup. So what did he do? He gave him the cup. And what do you think happened? The robbers presumed that this was his entire wealth, and they left the house. Right? It's a famous trick, right? People have some. I'm not saying you should do this, but some people will keep a stack of $100 bills next to their front door, and if a robber comes, they give them $100 and say this is all they have. Why the robbers don't know, I don't know. Maybe they do know. I'm not sure. Okay. So also made the rabbis. He said he went in front of Rabbi. He said, "Question: does the guy have to pay for it or not?" Presumably, he was a shomer chinam, an unpaid watchman. So Patra, he said that he's exempt. What do you mean? This leads to a complicated question, which we'll lead off tomorrow. But he's saving himself his own wealth with his friend's money, and that's prohibited. He should have to pay. In other words, over here, he's delaying the robbers by giving them a silver cup. So that's saving his own property. So you should have to pay for it. Ravashi Chazinan. Ravashi says we evaluate. Okay, if the guy was independently wealthy, they came for his own wealth. And therefore, by giving them the silver cup, he effectively saved himself with his friend's money. And then he would have to pay for the cup. However, if the guy is not known to be wealthy, we suspect the robbers came because the cup was there. So he's actually not even saving himself. He's giving the robbers exactly what they were looking for. And therefore, he's completely exempt. Okay, one more scenario. There was a guy who was custodian over a bag of money that was going to be used to redeem captives. A very interesting story. So he has a bag of money to be used to redeem captives. What happens next? What do you think happens? The robbers come to capture him. He says the robbers came to capture him. So what did he do? So he took the bag of money and he gave it to them. Also, Rava says, Patra, you're exempt. What do you mean? These are supposed to redeem other captives. He took the money and he saved his own skin with money that was supposed to be used to redeem captives. He should have to pay for it. He says to him, this is the greatest example of redeeming captives. Very good, Eric. Excellent. Have a great day.